Welcome to Nobody Tells You This. I'm Laura Massetti. Nobody tells you that the most important relationship in your entire career starts the moment that you get your first manager. Nobody tells you what the manager actually needs from you. And nobody tells you that some of the biggest career friction that you'll have within the first 5 years is not about your work. It's about the relationships that you hold. Jeff Sigel is a leadership advisor and coach who has spent 20 years inside some of the most demanding corporate environments in food manufacturing, grocery retail, and restaurants before dedicating his entire career to helping leaders at every level of work. He's the author of The Middle Matters, a toolkit for middle managers, and the creator of the Middle Matters course. Jeff Sigel, before we get started with everything else, I'd like you just to walk the audience through your own professional journey and your background for more context.
Sure. So I always like to tell people that I started out my career with the toughest marketing job I've ever had, which was when I was a high school physics teacher. So I started out my career as a physics teacher and then ended up becoming a marketer. Especially given the topic that you focus on, my very first business job was a total disaster. I think I lasted about 6 weeks and then quit, and then somehow was still there like 6 months later or something. But I was working for a small sort of boutique marketing consulting firm. Actually, in hindsight, learned a lot from really not understanding how to manage a very challenging in that experience. So I'm sure we'll come back to that point. But then I decided I really needed to get a real job, I guess, as well. I'll say, and I went off to business school and discovered brand management and got a job at Nabisco working on, my first job was on Ritz crackers. And at some point I worked on Oreo cookies and all those kind of fun cookie and cracker brands. Which then led me to brand roles at the Hershey Company. And so I always tell people my kid's favorite title I ever had was when I was the director of Twizzlers and Jolly Ranchers.
Way. Is that a real job title?
Yeah. And in fact, I am so disappointed because I'm hoping that somewhere in our garage, there's like a bin with some like old business cards in it, because I really feel like I should have framed that because it's just such a cool title. Anyway,
and then I went. Yeah, you definitely have peaked in your career a couple of years ago after that time.
Like nothing's ever been the same since. But anyway, from there, I actually ended up as a vice president of marketing planning at Ahold, which is a European and US based grocery company. So in Europe, it's Albert Heijn and various other banners, but in the US, northeastern US, it's Stop and Shop and Giant and so forth. That was actually really, I'm sure we'll talk about that one as well, but a fascinating experience where I learned an awful lot about leadership. I feel like the toughest jobs I've ever had are the ones where I really learned the most. And then from there, I ended up as the vice president of marketing at Cracker Barrel, and then ultimately as the vice president of corporate strategy and business intelligence there. And then I left the corporate world about a little over 2 years ago. And the very first thing I did was I wrote a book called The Middle Matters, a toolkit for middle managers, which is really just stories from all of those that whole time I was, at different levels, but always in the middle, right? I always had people reporting to me, people that I reported to, and all the people around me, and so all those challenges. And so I often say, the book is really like a lot of stories of me messing stuff up and learning something from it, and then wanting to share that so that people didn't have to, at least, everybody's going to make their own mistakes, but at least they could, learn from my mistakes and not make the same ones. And that work has sort of morphed into what I do now, which is training and coaching. So I train, I go into companies and train teams on managing up. If I'm working with individual contributors, I train middle leaders on sort of understanding their middle management roles. And then I often work with senior leaders who have to create the culture in which, these teams, are actually able to sort of take the accountability and ownership that they need to. And that training then sort of has morphed into executive coaching. And so I work with people at all different levels, but usually there is a sort of the commonality is that they need to step up either for their own career. They want to move, they want to either move up, or they've just been promoted, but they don't really understand kind of the ins and outs of that new role. So I work with individuals, but I also work with companies where you go in and they're like, we need our senior leaders or whatever to elevate their roles and step up. And so that's the work that I do these days. So that's the, I don't know, medium length version of my career so far. So
What an interesting story. I didn't know about your whole candy journey. That part's new to me. But what's so interesting and where I think our worlds collide a lot is I'm focused on the early professional side of things, which I think is super difficult place to be and navigate through.
100%.
But I think that just as difficult, finally, when you have that aha moment in your career where you're like, okay, I got this. I got my head around what I'm doing. You get put into a management job and
Yes.
suddenly you're like, what am I supposed to do? But that middle management is so tricky because you have that independence, but you don't. So yeah, I think it's such an interesting space.
I feel like, I mean, I don't know if you've experienced this over the course of your career, but for me, what I feel like is every level that I've moved up into in my career, you always sort of look up from the lower below it and be like, what are these people doing? Like, they're in charge. They should be able to do something about these, but whatever's not working, whatever. And what I feel like you learn at every level, from the most junior level all the way up to like becoming a VP or whatever, is that you are not in charge. You always have a boss. There's always somebody above you who is, even, in a public company, or even a private company, there's a board, right? The CEO themselves has somebody they have to report to and be accountable to and so forth. And so your belief when you are at the very beginning of your career is you're looking at these people going, what are these idiots doing? And it's like, no, it's so much more complex than you can see from your vantage point. And so I always say every time I get to the next level, I'm like, suddenly I see like, wow, this is what I did not understand. So I don't know if you've had that experience.
I absolutely have. And I've been part of that level, probably at every level of there's someone else to blame up top for why things aren't right. And then suddenly you step into that role and people are doing the same about you. So I feel like it's kind of stopped me from blaming my superiors at this point because, I think that organizations are a lot more complex than you really know. There's a lot of different layers. There's a lot of different personalities. There's a lot of different cultures. And it's always great to think that you'll have a hand in changing that. And I think you do, but it's never to the scale that frustrates you.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting. I want to pick up on something you said because our topic today is about managing up. And I think you just sort of hit on the most important thing about managing up. And by the way, I should clarify, like when I say the word managing up, I do not mean giving feedback to your boss. Like people are like, oh, I don't want to give feedback to him. I'm like, yeah, don't do that. Like, that's not going to go that well. No, what I mean by managing up is, how do you show up and take ownership of your own work. But what's interesting is the most fundamental principle of managing up is the ability to take the perspective of the person that you work for. Like, can you see the world, at least in part, your world, at least in part, from the way they see it, as opposed to being so caught up in your view of the world that you don't understand, that you are essentially reacting to them without understanding the bigger picture of all the other things that they have. Like, they have a boss, they have a million things on their plate. They're busy, they are insecure too, they're worried about their job, and you're sitting there thinking, oh, my boss is just this annoying person that tells me what to do. No, they're not. They are human beings. And I think that ability to recognize that is the beginning of managing up. That's where you have to start.
Yeah. It's hard, especially when you're someone that takes what they do so seriously. If you're an individual contributor or a lower level manager, you're so focused on the results and you're like, well, why aren't they giving the same priority to what I'm doing and the same reaction to what I'm doing? But you're right. There are other things happening around your project, your team, whatever it may be.
Right. I mean, in an ideal world, I know this is going to sound a little backwards, but in an ideal world, nobody in the organization should care about what you are doing as much as you do, right? That's the whole point. So that They don't
That's
have to care about it. That's why they're delegating it
yeah.
to you. And if you, and then so, but it's a hard thing to recognize because you're like, I don't understand why my boss isn't, paying more attention to this. This is so important, whatever. And it's like, well, okay, if your boss has 5 other people, then at least they have 5 other equally, important things that they need to be focused on. They've got a
Yeah.
lot going on. The question is, how do you actually make sure that the stuff that you're doing gets the attention that it needs? That's your job, not their job. I think a lot of times people think, oh, my boss should just know all these things. No, your boss doesn't know all these things because your boss is not spending day in and day out doing all the work that you're doing.
Yeah. No, at that level of preparedness, communication, and visibility makes all the difference in how you show up as a professional. But
Yeah.
let's take it back for a second in terms of
Sure.
people that may not have a solid background on managing up, because there is this little dark way that it can come across as if you're sucking up, you're overly appeasing to your superiors. So for someone that's new to the industry, to business, what does managing up mean and why does it matter?
Yeah. So let me start from, and actually in my book that I mentioned earlier, I have this framework that I talk about that's really sort of fundamental, and it's this idea that when you're in a middle leadership role, that you actually have 3 roles, right? You are doer, leader, and influencer. And over the course of your career, all of those roles play, sort of have different weights, right? When you're at the very beginning of your career, you're mostly a doer. And then maybe you become a manager and you're sort of shifting from doer into leader. And then over time, as you get up to the upper echelons, you're actually shifting more into a more influence role, meaning it's much more important my ability to get people who don't work for me and that I don't work for to be willing to support me and do the things I need them to do. So the managing up role is the doer role, right? The doer role is all about the relationship you have with your boss. And what I always say to people is that fundamentally the goal of the relationship you have with your boss is to create credibility. Does your boss believe, number 1, that you will get things done? Number 2, that you will get things done well? Number 3, that you will get them done on time? And number 4, which I think people miss all the time, is that you will get things done without drama. Those are and so ultimately, your job in managing up is, again, get things done well, get things done on time, and get them done without drama. So what does that look like? Well, what it looks like is you understand the details of your job. When you are asked to do something, you don't immediately go, oh my God, I'm going to eye roll. You're why is my boss asking me to do this? You have a can-do attitude. Okay, my boss just asked me to do something. I don't know how to do it. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, whatever, but I'm going to figure it out. And a lot of this is, and then, a lot of this really boils down to so when you get asked to do something, for example, that you don't know how to do, how do you show up? Do you show up and go to your boss, I don't know what to do? Or do you show up and say, hey, I've looked into this. Here's what I've figured out so far. Here's where I'm stuck. Here's where I need your help. Can you help me figure this out? That's a very different way of showing up. And that's what I mean by managing up. Managing up is not the dark side of managing up is there's actually 2 sort of dark sides, I guess. One is
Tell
sort
me
of
about the dark sides.
one of them is you suck up to your boss, like you said. The other one is that you basically decide your boss is an idiot, right? And you decide that you know better than them. And then what you do is you start giving your boss feedback, right? Oh, you're doing, you don't understand this. You don't understand me. You're not leading me the right way. You're a micromanager, blah, 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 all that stuff. So that's the danger zone of of managing up. And a lot of people don't want, when they hear the term managing up, they think immediately of that. And most people then go, I don't want to do that. I don't want to tell my boss that they're wrong or tell my boss that they're an idiot or whatever, because for obvious reasons, they don't want to get into that or whatever. And so they feel very uncomfortable with it. And I always say to people, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, how do you show up in your boss's office and not sort of dump your problems on them, right? So I don't know how to do this is not a very effective way of working with your manager, right? A much more effective way is say, here's what I've tried. Here's what I've already done. Showing up in their office and saying, hey, there's a problem with X, Y, and Z, right? You can show up and just say, hey, there's a problem. And they're like, okay, well, I've got a million problems. Like, what are you going to do about it? And so they start to go, so the boss sort of starts to jump in and be like, all right, well, have you tried this? Have you tried that or whatever? No, what you want to do is you want to show up with a problem in your boss's office and you want to say, there's this problem that's come up. Here's what I've already done to work on it. The team has got it. We've got it fixed. We've got it handled. I just wanted to let you know, right?
Mhm.
That's a very different way of showing up in your boss's office. Or you're looking at something and you go, my boss asked me to do something in a certain way. And I looked at it and I said, this isn't the way I would do this. I think there's a better way. So do you walk into your boss's office and say, hey, you're wrong. I think we should do it this way. Or, hey, boss, I just looked into this and there's the way, I looked into the way you proposed and I looked into this other option and I just wanted to put those in front of you and say, I would recommend we go this way. Is there something I'm missing or does that make sense to you? Right? Again, all of these things are about how do you show up in your manager's office in a way where you're showing up with confidence. That doesn't mean you know everything, but you're never showing up and being like, I don't know what to do. Tell me what to do. And it's interesting. And well, I'm sure we'll talk about micromanagement at some point, but like, it's very interesting is like when you show up and say, I don't know what to do, you're inviting your boss to micromanage you, right? When you show up in your boss's office with like, here's my plan. Here's what I'm planning to do, or here's how I'm going about this, or here's my recommendation. They're much less likely to micromanage you because like, oh, that person has it handled.
Yeah, exactly. And I love what you're saying because I think that a lot of people with the manager-employee relationship feel like managers fully control the game. And the fact is that there is a huge opportunity for the employee themselves to really take their control of the situation of kind of dictating the experience that they're going to have, right? Like what they're looking to get out of their managers in the organization. And just far too often I hear things like, oh, I have a terrible manager. I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on my own podcast. I was going to
I think that's up to you, but
right? I don't know if I need to put explicit if I curse, but I am a curse. But I have a terrible manager, and that's it. Like story ends there. I have a terrible manager. That means that I can't get ahead, that I won't get value out of my role, that I can't contribute well. But it's really about identifying what's not working well with that relationship and what can you do as the employee on the other side to help navigate that and get the results and the response back. It's a human to human relationship, right? Like remove all titles. It's like fundamental.
Yeah, and I think I'll pick up on something you just said there is it's so important to start with the idea that you're back to that point about perspective from the beginning of you have to start with the idea that your boss is human, right? So many people look at their boss and think my boss is some sort of like, delegation automaton or something, whatever. It's like, no, they're a human being, right? And so it's fascinating. Like I always ask people who let's use micromanagement because it's like seems to be a fan favorite, right? Of like toxic boss behavior, right? Like my boss is micromanaging me. It's soul crushing. What's going on? And I always tell them the same thing. I'm like, or I always ask the same thing. When somebody says my boss is micromanaging me, I always say, do you know why your boss micromanages you? And the answer usually is, oh, they're mean, they're jerk, like whatever it is. And it's like, but that's not the reality, right? The reality is your boss micromanages you because they're insecure, right? They're worried that your work is going to reflect badly on them because they're worried about their boss. That's why they're micromanaging you. And so the question isn't, is that good or bad? It's just human, right? It's just a human behavior. And the question for you is, what are you going to do about it? And so actually, if you'll bear with me for a second, I want to just share a quick story about this. So there was this person probably about a year and a half ago. It was September. She reaches out to me and we end up having lunch and we're having lunch. And then over lunch, she says, hey, Jeff, I have an ulterior motive. I read your book. My boss is a micromanager. It's soul crushing. What do I do about it? And I told her exactly what I was just saying. I'm like, your boss is micromanaging you because they're insecure. what you need to do is, I call it feeding the beast. Just give them way more detail than they could possibly ever want. And eventually what will happen is they will be like, could you please stop giving me so much detail, right? Because you're basically like, I'm going to feed the insecurity with, security, whatever. And she goes off. She doesn't live in Boston. But she had been in Boston for that lunch. And so she went off, and I didn't see her again until January. And she came back, she comes back to Boston in January. She's like, hey, you want to have coffee? And we're having coffee. And I'm like, so how did it go? And she says, well, it was going great. And I was like, okay, tell me more. Like, what happened that it was going great and it isn't going great now? And she said, well, my boss completely changed. I did all those things that you said. My boss was totally different. And she said, but then I went on vacation for the holidays for 2 weeks. And when I came back, my boss was like right back to the way she was before. And I just sort of paused for a second and go, well, of course, like, you didn't change your boss. And she's like, what are you talking about, Jeff? She's like, this boss was a completely different person. And I was like, no, you can't change your boss. You can only change the way you prompt your boss. It's like Boss GPT. And I
That's
said,
so good. Yeah.
and I said to her a couple of things. One was, I said, you know how I know that that's true? I said, because when you stopped prompting her, she went back to her default, right? Yeah. She was behaving the way you wanted her to behave because you were prompting her differently. And then I said, this is nothing new. Humans have been prompting humans since the day we were born. You cry, you get food is a prompt. And so I always think it's interesting because people would say, oh, Jeff, Boss GPT, that's such a great analogy. And I'm like, no, that's actually not an analogy. The chat GPT is an analogy of human beings, not that, right. Boss GPT is like, we are not an analogy of AI. AI is an analogy of us. And so to me, what I think is really fascinating, especially in this current moment where we are learning about how to use these large language models, is that we actually can learn from prompting large language models about how to be better human beings and how to prompt people better. And if you really, so what I said to this woman was like, if you want your boss to go back to being the way she was before the holidays, just go back to the way you were prompting her before the holidays. Right. And so I didn't see this person again until June. And when I saw her in June, I said, how's it going? She's like, it's going great. You're right. Because fundamentally it's about this idea of how you prompt. So if you can start from the assumption when you're managing up that you cannot change your boss, because it is almost impossible to change another human being to do something different, but you can change the way you prompt.
Right. You sound like my therapist, Jeff. You sound like my therapist, because I think it's really what people have been saying for years, but I think, in every type of relationship that you have,
100%,
but there's a power dynamic in the workplace that it doesn't feel the same, right? So I think that's a big part of what intimidates people to just be humans, just talk to people like people.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the other idea that I wanted to just bring in here was, so I have this idea. Actually, I don't know if you can see, I have like a bunch of books behind my head here.
I do.
So I'll tell you what they are. And this is Jeff's reading list for like any new professional. You should read all of these books. So it's Radical Candor. It's Extreme Ownership. It's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's Atomic Habits. And it's Carol Dweck's Mindset, right? And I put those on my shelf because those are the books that were so impactful when I was writing my own book. And after I wrote my book, I wrote an article about this idea that I call the Radical, Extreme, Highly Effective Atomic Ownership Mindset. And the idea of that mindset is basically boiled down into this sort of phrase, which is, the world is not as it should be. It is as it is. And people don't do what they should do. They do what they do. So what are you going to do about it? That's that sort of extreme ownership piece. So that's the other piece of this is, if you recognize that everybody is human, including your boss, your spouse, your kids, whatever, and you think about things from their perspective, and then you add into that this, hyper recognition of your own personal responsibility in making things happen, you will recognize that your whole experience as an employee, as a spouse, as a parent, as a child, or whatever, is really based ultimately on how you decide to act in that relationship. How do you prompt the other person? Now, I'm not saying there aren't people who are difficult, mean, etc., but you can actually get the meanest, most difficult bosses, if you prompt them in the right way, to actually work in your favor and to
Yeah.
support you. It is possible, but not if your brain is going, this person's mean. So,
Yeah.
because when you think about a boss who's micromanaging you as mean, you're going to treat them the way you would treat a mean person. But if you think about them as, this person's just insecure and they're worried about how this is going to look for them or whatever, then you will treat them as an insecure person. You will just behave differently when you get in your head, this person's differently, and it's my job to figure out how to work with them. I
Yeah.
don't know. Some people, I think, find that, sort of at first when they hear that, they're like, wow, that seems really annoying. So I don't know what your initial reaction.
Oh, no, it's not. It's not really annoying. I think that it goes back to, you need to take full ownership of your life, right? You can't walk
Exactly.
into any scenario, any company, any situation to say, okay, I'm here now and I deserve this, right? Like, you have to be the one to make those changes, make those efforts. I want to push it in a different direction because you
Mhm.
inspired me with the mean comments, because I agree with you. You get in situations where you might have a tough boss, micromanaging, all the adjectives, right? But what I actually find harder is cross managers, meaning cross leaders, cross
Mm,
groups that for whatever reason can be difficult. Right.
mm,
And so, do you have any advice as far as managing those cross directional
mm.
teams and folks?
So you're saying, like, when you're dealing with people who are not reporting to you, you don't report to them, but they're being difficult?
Well,
Is that what you're saying?
yeah, yes, that's
Yeah.
exactly what I mean, because a lot of people assume management responsibilities over you, even if you're not on their team, but they might have a
Right.
title, right? And so
Yep.
there's almost like this expectation of reporting outside of your direct
100%.
report structure. And I see that happening all the time. And it's so hard to navigate that because there's like a power dynamic, right? But
Yeah.
then there is also the reality of like, this is my chain of command. I
Yeah.
don't really need to do all
100%.
that.
Yeah, so I think, I'll say there are three things, right, that I'm going to add in another idea. So one is this idea of, radical, extreme, highly effective atomic ownership. Like, it's up to you to figure it out. So that's where you have to start. And then the second piece is that they're human beings and you're going to prompt them. So back to this human GPT, boss GPT idea or whatever it is. But the third piece, when you're dealing with anyone, is to, I always tell people, when we're in the realm of influence, and that's what we're talking about, right? This is the realm where I can't use hierarchy, because your boss, by the way, cares about your work because you report to them. And the people that report to you care about your work because they report to you. But these cross-functional people, sometimes they don't care or whatever. So the most important thing that I always tell people is, it's obviously situational, but the fundamental idea to keep in mind is this: that everybody, in the end of the day, is the hero of their own story, right? That everybody it's like we're all living in a movie where we are the main character, right? And so if you think about this other person, this other leader, or this cross-functional colleague or whatever that isn't doing what it is that you need them to do, from the perspective of, like, somewhere in their head, there's a movie going on where they are the main character, they are the hero, and you can only play one of two roles in their movie. You can either be a villain, or you can be a supporting character. Those are your choices. And if you want the other person to behave in the way you want them to, I would recommend becoming the supporting character. Don't be the villain. So when you basically go to somebody whose priorities don't match up with yours, because they've got a million things and they've got a boss and they've got all these things that they need to do, their priorities don't match up with yours, but you need to get them to do something that isn't one of their priorities. What you need to do is figure out, how do I make this priority feel like something that is of mine, feel like something that supports them? There's lots of ways to do it, right? One is, I'll do this I'm going to do this for you, and or I'll do something for you if you do something for me, right? That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to spend some time actually understanding what it is that are their priorities. So I'll give you a perfect example. Let's say you have a cross-functional colleague on a team and you need them to produce some report and you really need it by Tuesday, and they're like freaking out at you because they're like, I can't do this by Tuesday, whatever. Well, probably what the reason they can't do it by Tuesday is because their boss, who's a much more important person in terms of like how they decide what the priorities are, basically said, you have to do this other thing by Tuesday. So the first thing to do is ask them, like, well, help me understand, like, this is what I'm looking for. And this is what I need. How does that fit into your world? Like, how is this going to work? Can you do this? Is it realistic? Whatever. And if they say no, then one of the things you can do is like, hey, is there some way I can, like for example, could I build the spreadsheet and set it up and put stuff in there, and all you have to do is check it, right? And they'd be like, oh yeah, that would be really helpful. Or is there something on your plate that I could take off, from your plate so that you can do this? Or this is really important. I think we both agree this is really important. Is there some way I can help, smooth things with your boss so that they recognize that this is a priority and that they give you, I mean, again, how are you going to help them? But it starts from again, back to that whole point of like, this other person that you're dealing with is a human who is just trying to get their job done, do a good job, maybe get promoted. They've got career aspirations. They've got a boss. Maybe their boss is a micromanager, whatever, who knows, whatever it is. If you don't understand that first, you basically just do this because it's your job or whatever it might work occasionally, but at some point what's going to happen is they're not going to like you very much, and they're not liking you means that your stuff is going to get deprioritized. Like, I'm going to do stuff first for the people who get me and who, care about me and whatever. And so understand their perspective, ask them, be a human. Hey, what's going on in your world? Like, I realize this is a last minute thing and I really didn't intend for that, but it's like, it's really important. What do you need me to do so that we can get this done? Whatever, but just support them as opposed to just getting annoyed with them, because all getting annoyed with them does is, like, in your movie, they're being a villain, but in their movie, you're being a villain. That doesn't work well, right? It doesn't go very far. I don't know.
I like that. And I think that it's probably the cross-functional teams and that dynamic, I think, is just as important as the manager dynamic, because I worked in sales forever and we were like this with the marketing team.
Yeah.
In terms of, or I should say, in many organizations, we weren't close, but we depended on each other a lot.
Yeah.
Right. But we all had our different timelines. We all had our different priorities. But at the end of the day, we were trying to win new business. Like that was our goal.
Yeah.
Retain customers and build customers. But there was always such a disconnect in terms of how those teams function. But you're right. At the end of the day, finding out their priorities, being able to communicate with them, how you can help each other out. It sounds so basic, but I think in a big organization especially, it gets so much more complicated.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you find this with the folks that you work with, but people always say, like, when you're hiring somebody, what is the thing that you look for the most? And I'd be fascinated to hear what you say, but my answer is always curiosity. Like, it is by far the most important. I would rather have somebody who is a curious learner than somebody who is a sort of calcified expert on my team any day. Because a curious learner, and if somebody's listening to this, they're not going to be able to see what I'm doing, but a curious learner is like if you think about, sort of the graph of a curious learner, like they're going to do this, right? The calcified expert is going to do this. So I'm making a straight line for anybody who's listening. I'm making a straight line versus an upward sloping line, but the person who's stuck at this level and doesn't want to learn is basically going to be surpassed by the curious person every time, because it's just math, right? So I always look for that. And so that willingness to be open and listen and hear and say, hey, what's going on over there? And what's important to these other people? That's curiosity.
Yeah.
I'd be fascinated to hear if you have a different thing that you look for, but that's what I would.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because when I hire people, I actually care so much less on their background and their skill set. Curiosity, I'm not going to steal your word, but like that's my that's my leading quality that I
Yeah.
have as a professional. And that's probably why I've pivoted careers now and doing something else. But for me, it's hard work. And I think that's tied with curiosity. I'd rather someone that's going to work hard wants to be there, like truly wants to be there and grow, rather than someone that has all the skills that might look good on paper. Because you
Yes.
want someone that's like energized, like can match the energy that you bring to the room. Think that's it. And I think positivity, because the one thing that I cannot take on anyone on my team is someone that's negative. I think it's like a cancer on a
Yeah.
team spreading. So, yeah, those are mine.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting as you were talking about, I was thinking about we haven't hit on this career mobility sort of side of managing up. Like, how do people tell you people all the time, you should manage your career. And the question is, what does that mean? Well, walking into your boss's office and saying, I demand a raise and a promotion is not a very effective way to manage up for your career. At the very least, if we just very quickly step back into their perspective, like bosses, and especially like if you're like an individual contributor and your boss is a manager, and you walk into your boss's office and say, and this, by the way, I've coached people this, on the manager side of this. This seems to happen a lot, where very junior people will walk into their boss's office and be like, I want a promotion, I want a bigger bonus, whatever, and the manager's sitting there like, me too, like, but I don't get to decide those things. It's like people, again, this goes back to like people, when you're very junior, very new, you don't understand how the system works, right? And so it's just this interesting thing of how do you ask to be promoted, basically, without asking your boss to do something that isn't possible. And my favorite question to ask if you want to get promoted is not, promote me. That doesn't work. And it's not even, what do I need to do to get promoted? It's what would need to be true for me to get promoted, which is a different question. This is you saying, I don't know whether you're going to promote me or not. I'm just asking you, what are the things that need to be true? Because now you're not going to tell me, like, if I say, what do I need to do? Your boss might say nothing. You don't have to do anything.
And
You're
that's
doing
a
great.
very common answer, right? Because
Right.
you're doing great. You're nothing.
Exactly.
Keep doing what you're doing.
Right.
Right.
And what that could mean is because you're never going to get promoted, or that could mean because there's no place to promote you, or it might mean like, you're on track to get promoted. But if you ask them what would need to be true to get promoted, now they say, well, a position would have to open up, and you would have to have demonstrated this, this, and this skill. And, we would have to get you exposure to this and blah, blah, blah. And now they've told you all the things that would need to be true. And now you have a real conversation that you can have when they say like, oh, okay, well, how do I get into a position? What can we work together so I can get in a position where the next time a position does come open, I'm like the top candidate where you go, Jeff's the guy. That is a way of, that's managing your career and managing up. Managing up is not telling your boss like, promote me or I'm going to quit, because your boss, in all likelihood, if you're an individual contributor, your boss has so little say in whether you get promoted or not that you have no idea, right? I mean, the only say they have is like, they're basically the person that gets to say, yeah, I think this person's ready, which is important, don't get me wrong, but they do not get to be like, and I think we should make a position for them, or like that doesn't happen. It's just complicated.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think a big piece is understanding the context of your organization as well, because oftentimes those promotions happen on an annual basis, happen on a whatever basis. So yeah, I think that's wonderful advice. Jeff, we have been chatting, and you have been so valuable for this conversation and a new perspective, which we haven't talked about yet on managing up. So as we close out, every guest that I have on the podcast, I ask them this one question. Okay, so within your career, within your professional life, nobody told you this, but once you found it out, it's changed everything for you.
Yeah, I think we've talked about a lot of this, but I think nobody told me, how this point we were talking about before, nobody told me that the further you move up, you actually don't get more power, you just get more responsibility and accountability, right? And that, I think, is the thing that's so important to realize as you're moving up in your career, is that as you move up, you just become more accountable. But it also means, when you're thinking about this from say, the position where you're a junior person, is your boss has a lot of pressure on them. And so your job is, if you want to get ahead, your job is to figure out how you don't become an additional problem in their world.
I love it. I love it. That's so powerful, because it goes back to you taking ownership of that conversation and that feeling and that interaction. So Jeff,
100%.
thank you so, so much. Where can we find you, or can we connect with you, and also share a little bit about where we could find your book as well?
Sure. So LinkedIn, best place to find me. I post blog articles every week, so please, follow me there. My website is jeffsigel.com. And you can find my book on Amazon. Or if you're more of a book listener, at some point I decided I was going to post it as a podcast on Spotify. So my book exists out there as an audio book on Spotify under The Middle Matters. So that's where you can find
Amazing.
me.
Okay, The Middle Matters by Jeff Sigel. So we will put it all in the show notes. Thank you so much, Jeff, again. It's been such a pleasure.
Absolutely. Great conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.